over the last week, it's pretty much the only thing that everybody has been talking about has been USAID and what's been going on in terms of what Elon's been uncovering and what people have been finding out. And the reason I think for that is that USAID has come to be kind of the center point for the larger story, that everybody is sort of waking up and realizing that, kind of the system that they've been fighting against in terms of the media, in terms of the NGOs, in terms of people weaponizing the justice system, the lawfare, kind of all of it, the entire thing. It always felt like it was acting in a unified sense against us. And now suddenly we find out that we've been paying for it and that the entire system was essentially financially funded through USAID, other measures obviously as well, but that USAID was kind of a conduit that allowed this graft. And that all those funds flowing out into the system basically focused all of Washington, D.C. In order to continue that, they needed to act in sort of this unspoken unity. And we had all these D.C. elites that are getting rich off taxpayer money, and to perpetuate that graft have been acting in lockstep against us. And I think it's that realization that has really grabbed everybody's attention and has them so focused on this, rightly so, on this story.
Someone asked me the other day, didn't we know this before?
Right.
What about these databases like usaspending.gov and the various other ones? There are some new ones that have propped up these past few days, but USA spending has been around for forever. So anyway, the question was, well, did Elon uncover this, or did we already know this and we just didn't search? And the answer is really quite simple. We did know it and we did search it. And you and I wrote about it many, many times, going back many years. USAID's involvement in Ukraine, in seeding that whole conflict back in 2013-14. USAID's involvement in Ukraine since, always pushing these false narratives, in particular anti-Trump narratives. USAID's involvement, of course, with the Wuhan lab. I mean, how many times did we write about that? They got a lot more money, the lab did, from USAID than they ever did from Fauci.
Yeah.
And we've dug into this over and over, and we have so much stuff out on that. So yes, these databases were searchable, and you were able to find out about these connections, and we and many others did. I think, however, what's changed is, as you alluded to, Elon went in there and exposed the entire thing. He made us all zoom out and look at the entire picture, not just, oh, they were corrupt here, they were corrupt there, and so on. No, he exposed the fact that they were corrupt everywhere. It's totally pervasive. It's everywhere. Everything they did was in some way corrupt, either in terms of pushing Democrat agenda items, their far left woke policies, that kind of stuff, or in terms of the kickbacks coming through, or in terms of these color revolutions and that kind of stuff that were being organized through USAID. I mean, anywhere you look and everywhere you look, it's the same story. The whole thing was completely corrupt. Elon said it's not like an apple that has a couple of worms in it. It's just a ball of worms. That's all it is, the whole thing. And I think that was the hugely important part. Now, some of these stories, like the newspapers all being funded by USAID, now we knew that in terms of, for instance, these Ukrainian newspapers, like 90% of their news was paid by USAID. And the brilliant thing of cutting off that spigot, right after Trump came in, and then Elon chose USAID as sort of his first target. And he's explained since the reason he did that is because these were the most uncooperative. So Elon's unit called Doge, they basically sent requests to all the different agencies and departments requesting data. And the ones who were most recalcitrant, the ones who were most difficult and sabotaging everything, they were USAID. So immediately that meant, well, those are the ones we're going to have to go in first. And that's exactly what they did. And before, I think before Elon even announced anything, you had Ukrainian newspapers cry foul that they were going to have to shut down. This is like in January. This is like earlier than when all these things started unraveling in this past week. And then, of course, people were like, wait a minute, and not just Ukrainian, it was like in Hungary and Poland and everywhere. It was like, whoa, newspapers shutting down because of USA. What? And then people started kind of asking, questions beyond what we already talked about. Like we knew about the Wuhan lab, we knew about these political umbrella revolutions and that kind of stuff. But the idea, the fact that it went on every level, deep, wide, everywhere, that is kind of new. It's been a huge paradigm shift, and yeah, no, it's exposed so much. I think in overall terms, it's really exposed the illusion of Democrat policies. The fact that any of this was ever popular, the fact that people wanted this or that. No, they didn't. This was all astroturfed.
Yeah, I mean, at the kind of the largest picture at all, it's the idea that the Democrat Party is effectively a hollow shell of fabrication. That the only reason that they've been so successful, and I think a lot of people ask themselves that, like, how is a party that promotes some of the policies that they do gain so much traction? Well, the answer is they're not on a fundamental basis. They're doing it only purely on a financial basis. If you took away the finances, I can't imagine where the Democratic Party would be. It's already in deep trouble. I mean, this may be the death knell. I always kind of thought when people would ask that question about, didn't you know this before? One of the things I would always think about were the omnibus spending bills that were put forth. And, Rand Paul would put out these examples of the massive amounts of graft, and everybody would kind of get outraged in the moment. But they would always just capitulate and just kind of let it go and then ultimately forget about it. And what's been interesting to me in this is that I think it's not as always the dollar amounts, because certainly the omnibus budgets contained billions of dollars that were being misspent. But here it's people seeing the dollars applied in specific ways. You mentioned the newspapers. It's not that much money. But people are seeing the fact that, holy crap, there was maybe $34 million, whatever, that went to Politico. I forget the exact number. First it was 8, and then we realized, no, it was actually more, that was going to Politico. And of course, Politico did the 51 former intelligence officials. They ran the Steele dossier. It was that specificity, that personalization of the wrong that was done. Another great example is Bill Kristol. And the amount of outrage that came out of finding that just pretty much what everybody suspected anyway, that Bill Kristol wasn't organic in any way. He basically kind of sold his soul, whatever he had of it, for a huge amount of taxpayer money. And he's been getting all this funding all this time. And that's how he's able to survive and promote what he does. And the amount of outrage directed at Bill Kristol was incredible. Why? Because it was personalized. It was something that they could understand, as opposed to abstract amounts of hundreds of billions of dollars. It was something quantifiable where people had been sort of victimized by it, seeing Bill Kristol act as a never Trump to try to start a movement against Trump. It was something that was more visceral to people. And I think that's part of what's taking place right now.
It is. And what I'm so grateful for is the zooming out. You do get lost in the weeds when you come across this kind of stuff. So for instance, I already talked about the Wuhan lab. There was a story we did many years ago. It was like 2-3 years ago. It was very specific. It was about a guy, a senior executive at USAID, who was in charge of this, doling out money. And then he doled out money to a DASAC grift. You can only call it a grift, which was called Global Virome Project. It was one of these virus hunter things, which is just let me just pause here for a moment. I know this is, I'll go back to my train of thought here in a moment, but this is important because I don't think people realize, or I don't think enough people realize, that global virus hunting or whatever you want to call it is a grift. It has always been a grift. It is completely, there's no other word for it. There's no sane application for it. There's no reason to do it in any normal world, because there are so many viruses, millions upon millions, that change all the time in millions upon millions of ways, that by finding one or finding another, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. You find one and make an antidote to that one. Well, in the meantime, there's 100 million new ones that do completely different things. So the idea of going virus hunting is just ludicrous, idiotic, always was. The whole thing was always a grift. So let's come back now to this guy, Dennis Carroll. He was a USAID official, a very high-ranking official. He doled out huge amounts of money, USAID money, to one of these grifts, the Global Virome Project. And guess what? This was the one together with Daszak. And guess what? As soon as that project was set up or paid for by USAID, this Carroll guy left USAID and became the CEO of the project. Right. So we talked about this. We did this years ago, and various other examples of that. But here's my main point. It's always in the weeds. It's always focused on this corruption, that corruption, and so on. I think what's happened over the past week or so is that people have realized that it's all pervasive. It's everywhere. It's not just this guy. It's every guy. That's the thing. And I caught myself, I guess we sort of knew that, but maybe not with that 30,000-foot view. I certainly caught myself the other day thinking, my goodness, do you remember this troll that was like haranguing us about COVID origin, or that troll who was haranguing us about Russiagate or this or that? And I'm like, oh my goodness, they were all paid by USAID. This is how it all happened.
Something, yeah.
That was one of them, but there were this. Basically, I now my default assumption is that every single one of these people was paid by USAID, or one of these NED, whatever they're called, one of these government-funded slush funds.
It kind of seems like it's this violation of any sense of fairness that I think for the first time everybody sort of is able to put their finger on the thing that they've been feeling the entire time. Just like you were talking about, we knew that those guys were funded. We just didn't have, we had partial proof actually, but it's just one small example of many. But it's kind of this collective awakening of all those little anecdotes over the past however many years, whoever's been looking at this, for us, it's been since 2015, is a coming together that all those little anecdotes all add up to the same thing. That they've all been funded. It's all a giant grift. They've all been funded by the government with our taxpayer dollars that have been weaponized against us. I guess my first real insight of that, to feeling a real sense of outrage, was looking at what was happening in terms of USAID, State Department, and FEMA funding the illegals, basically funneling them when you and I were going through this, and realizing that we were paying for all of the NGOs that were driving the flow of illegals. Like, how could that be? How could our State Department be actively acting against us and funding all of that? And, that's now some time ago that we came across that. This is a whole nother level, that the entire system is funding the things that are acting against us. And, it perpetuates itself. I don't know how many people even, in certain instances there's collusion, but in other instances, everybody's incentivized to operate in the same manner in DC. So a lot of times they don't even have to talk. They just know what they're supposed to do. That might be exactly what happened with Politico. Politico may have gotten a little bit of pressure to run that Hunter laptop story. Remember, they actually wanted to run it. I think it might have been with the New York Times. It was another entity that they first wanted to run it through, and it didn't work out. Politico picks it up. Natasha Bertrand writes the story. And then what happens is the revenues to Politico go up. Does anything even need to be said in that instance? Maybe not. They just know what to do.
They push back by claiming that they put out this very specific message. This is another little thing you sort of get to see over time. And once you see it everywhere. If anyone gives you a very specific answer to a non-specific question, you should smell a rat. So the issue was whether Politico was in any way subsidized. And then they said that they had not received any direct payments or words to that effect. Now, of course, you can play around with that. If they get a subscription, it's just made to look proper and legitimate, and in the end, it's actually just a straight up subsidy. So this is all, you can make these constructs very, very easily. Where and this is another thing that's been exposed here these past few weeks, or this past week, where the payments are always in some indirect way, where they then come back and say, oh, well, we didn't get direct payments, or we weren't subsidized in this way or that way. But, well, actually you were, but you just called it a subscription, or you called it this, or you called it that. And that's such a beautiful thing as well, that there's this sort of collective realization that has been going on, and it's a thing of beauty, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Let's say, for let's just play a mind game here, where tomorrow Trump is gone, Elon's gone, everyone's gone, and Kamala's in charge or whatever. Could they go back to where they were? Yeah, I mean, they could refund USAID. They could send all these people back to their jobs. They could do all those things. But the one thing they cannot do, that cannot be done, cannot be undone, is the realization among hundreds of millions of people of what game was being played. I mean, there will not be a time going forward where there isn't the default assumption that anything to do with those kinds of slush funds or NGOs or whatever you want to call it, foreign aid, that's another one of those euphemistic things. Anytime those words get mentioned, people will from now on assume that it's some kind of grift.
And it's really, the toothpaste just is not going back in. It's been squeezed out and it's never going back. And that's one of the reasons why I think Elon was so smart to go with USAID, because kind of his first target, because USAID, it interlaces into everything. Yeah, it's only a $50 billion budget, and as if that's small. It's not, but it's not the largest thing. But because it interfaces with all of the NGOs and they're able to use funds to wash, other grants. I was calling it grant laundering. The idea that you can wash these grants through where they have a stated innocuous purpose, children's nutrition, and it ends up being used for illegal immigration or to fund, lawfare, whatever. That's what made it such a great place to start, because it interlaced through all of the NGOs and it interlaced into the corruption on kind of a day-to-day basis at DC. And now that you've got that, what's everybody doing? They're pleading with Elon and his group, go look at the IRS, go look at the Department of Defense, go look here, go look there, go look at Act Blue, which isn't, it's not a government agency, but it's certainly something that deserves investigation. And all coming back to your point that the scales are off of people's eyes, and no matter what happens, there's no going back on that. It's done now.
One other thing I'd mention as well, in terms of if we were just going to review what's happened here, over the past week or so, is I still find people who have had the scales removed from their eyes are focused on one or the other, or, in terms of, this was all a CIA front group, or, this was all a kickback scheme to Democrats. This was a color revolution scheme in places like Ukraine, and on and on. And again, I think I've already said this, but I think it's so important to say that it was all of the above. That's so important. And some of it was superficially legitimate. This is important as well. You'll come across some of these things where it looks legitimate because they need to make it look legitimate. So they get some purple-haired 20-year-old sitting in DC deciding that they want to fund, some project in Africa, and then they can hold that out as sort of, look, we're doing great things. So you really have all of the above going on at the same time. With that said, I personally think that the glue that holds it all together isn't ideology, isn't color revolutions, isn't wokeness, isn't any of those things. It's grift. That's the main thing that all of this it comes together, and ultimately in terms of grift. So grift in terms of the people who receive the money, say Daszak, because we already had that example. Grift in terms of the people who fund the money and then take it back later another way, say this other guy, the USAID guy we mentioned, who was collaborating with Daszak. Grift in terms of the politicians. So for instance, one of the things you heard, right, that President Trump shut down funding of South Africa. And then South African president came out and said, there's no funding. We don't receive any funding apart from a minute, tiny little HIV program. I was like, okay, let's see if that's true. So you go to the USA spending and just search for South Africa. Any money is going to South Africa. And suddenly you see there's 10 billion, 12 billion, not some minute whatever. And it's for all kinds of things. But then when you dig down into it, because then, you might still have some woke leftists or whatever tell you, oh, that's, poor country, poor people, they need this. But are they actually getting it? I mean, even if we assume for a moment that this is a good allocation of resources, which personally I don't think it is, but let's just assume sending 12 billion to needy people is a great thing. The problem is, what percentage actually reaches those people? So when you look at South Africa, you come across an organization in Durham in North Carolina. And incredibly, I'd never heard of this organization before. They have 11 different names, which makes the search of the database more complicated, probably on purpose. They call themselves, this is another one, the names always give it away. They call themselves Family Health International. But they've also got FH360. That's another name they give themselves, and various other names. You go to their website, and they claim to be experts in everything. They're experts in economic development, and they're experts in democracy, and they're experts in accountability, supposedly. They're experts in climate change. They're experts in all the keywords.
Just keep adding the hot buzzwords.
Exactly. These people take in so much money. It's unreal. Just for one project in South Africa, one single project, they're taking in $1 billion with a B dollars. This company in Durham, North Carolina. So how much of that goes to those people? Well, then you look at that company. They have 4,000 people. Then you start looking at their salaries. They all pay themselves in the sort of $500,000 range, at the upper end. That's more than the president earns. And then you go, okay, who's the congresswoman or congressman for that particular district, which is the 4th district? Oh, you come across this lady, and you go, oh, what has she said recently about USAID? Oh my goodness, she's losing her crap about USAID being defunded. So just in that one little example, you can see how it just spans everything. It's all pervasive. You got the people in Congress, you got the people in Durham, you got the people at the company, you got the executives on all that, the huge money, all of that, and it's supposedly for South Africa.
Well, I found 10 million going to a single clinic in Kenya for transgender effects. Like, that money's not all making it there. We had 53 million for a gas station that was a gas station. Obviously, that's something else entirely. But kind of going back to what you were talking about, I tend to think that for the large part, people go in sort of ideologically, but then the system gets them and the money gets them. And then it becomes about the money. And then once it becomes about the money, then the system naturally become part of this process to defend that. You don't want that exposed. So then everything becomes about perpetuating the system and not having any sunlight reach that system. And this goes to both sides of the aisle. It's not like it's just Democrats or Republicans. It's it's more the establishment, and they want to have that protected. And all of that, of course, comes back to why Trump was such an existential threat, because he truly came from outside. And they thought they got rid of him, and now he's back again, except this time he's really, truly empowered. It's an entirely different Trump this time around. And I mean, he's now able to act kind of like the deal maker that he's always, is at his heart. And suddenly that's just everybody's off, completely off balance and uncertain how to deal with it. But the entire responsive effort we're seeing from the screeching Democrats, et cetera, is because they know they don't want this exposed. It's a whole way of life. It is truly an existential threat, because once they go into that system, it then becomes structured to kind of feed off of all this corruption and graft.
USAID is sort of the perfect microcosm to explain something that we've talked about many, many times, which is the general sort of notion in DC that it's okay, you can have a Romney, you can have a Bush, and we'll have an Obama, and we'll have a Biden, and you can have a whatever. And it's been like that forever.
Optically, we can shift back and forth, but...
Exactly, because as you say, those people aren't going to rock the boat. But now we're getting... And everyone's been saying it for a long time. Everyone's known it for a long time. But now we're kind of putting flesh on the bones. what the rocking the boat actually means. Where the whole thing has just fallen apart and it's there for everyone to see. That's what they were protecting. And you're absolutely right that Trump was a threat to that. So when we now, when in 2016 people were throwing around words like, oh, Trump is a threat to the system and whatever, it was all true.
Yeah.
But now we have, again, flesh on the bones. Now we have specifics. Now we know exactly what it was. And we as you said earlier, we did know, but now we know with specificity on every single level. And we also know how far and wide this whole thing went.
Well, there's
And
something else that fundamentally that's different this time around, and that ties back to Trump. Is that for not only, people have always kind of known, and we've talked about how suddenly this realization bubbles up and it can be, they can feel it personally, but also they finally feel they have the chance to do something about it. Before, a lot of that anger and disappointment kind of got shoved down into apathy because, oh, nothing's going to change. For the first time ever, people really believe, wow, something actually can change. So let's go. Let's push. Let's expose everything we can because maybe we actually can make a fundamental change this time around. And I think that's energizing people to basically to no end. I think that's the fuel.
Elon is a very important part of that because he, more than any human being that's probably ever lived, he incorporates change, positive, and that actually works. You may or may not be a fan of electric cars, but or anyone may or may not be, but what happened with that, what he did to that industry is just astonishing. Even if you disagree with it, it's just astonishing. When he started this whole thing in 2007, 8, people were just laughing about it. Like, how are you ever going to, build a network of charging and how can you this and that and whatever? And he went and he did it. Or reusable rockets. People were laughing about him. Well, he went and did it. And now he's built the biggest flying object ever built. And it can actually land by itself. You could go through the whole list, Neuralink and all the amazing things he's done. I mean, Twitter, the turnaround, so many of us saw that in real time, what he did with that. So to have someone of that caliber, and it's not just that caliber, it is the highest caliber that's probably ever existed. I mean, he is the most talented person you could ever wish to have that's probably ever lived, that combines all of those talents. And I think more than anything, to come back to your point, Elon incorporates that, he exudes that belief, and then everyone else starts believing, we can actually change it. It is actually possible. It is doable because he has done it on all these other projects of his, throughout his career. So that's a huge, huge, huge part of why we're seeing what we're seeing. And it's absolutely amazing. And, then that made me think back of, the whole period from 2017 to 2020, 2021. Trump never really had a wingman. I mean, not one, but not anyone. I mean,
Not anyone.
just never had any. He was just surrounded by these absolutely awful people who were either incompetent, couldn't get anything done, hangers on, grifters. Some of them were just corrupt. I mean, but when I can't think of any time during Trump's first term where he ever had actual support. He was always on his own. Every single battle he fought on his own. Maybe Rudy Giuliani is the one that comes to mind that did try and help him out with this or that. But then he was just completely pushed aside by, he tried with the Russiagate scam and they just kind of rolled over him. Then he tried with the Ukraine scam and then they smeared him and they kind of sidelined him that way. That's the only one that I can think of. But
I can think of one other, and it highlights the same example, and that would be Peter Navarro. When you and I kind of dissected the whole COVID response thing, that's where it really hit home for me of how alone Trump really was, realizing that he was fighting against everybody. He was fighting against the COVID task force. He was fighting against the National Security Council, which was really kind of seemed like it was being directed almost by Fauci, maybe Pence, whatever. And the only person he had in his corner was Navarro. And of course, Navarro then got taken out. And that really kind of, for me, highlighted how alone he actually was during this whole thing. And now you talk about Elon. Something that you've said about Elon that I think is worth noting here. You've mentioned any number of times how is kind of a driving force for him is this quest to get to Mars, and that maybe that overarches everything. And if you have a certain goal or a quest, then you want to get rid of the things that are in the way of that. And everything that's been going on in terms of the corrupt, the government's response to Trump gets in the way of that for Elon. And I think that's also, a factor that's at play here. In other words, he's got kind of a higher goal. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's bringing him, he's got skin in the game, I guess, is what I'm sort of saying. It'll be interesting to see how things progress. The one thing I worry about is that they find a balance. Trump seems to be a bigger, stronger personality than ever, and that gives me a lot of hope. But you certainly have two big personalities kind of circling around in the ring, very friendly. And I hope that they continue to find a way to coexist. I've seen some signs from Elon where he sort of backs off and is properly deferential to Trump, and I hope that continues because he's such a weapon, and he's, as you said, a wingman, and Trump's never had one.
It was so funny the other day. I mean, the media has been, and Democrats have been trying this, all week. Well, they've been trying it ever since the election, but this past week they've really ramped it up. Where Elon is the bad guy, and it's all Elon, Elon, Elon. And so then they confront Trump with, but Elon is going to fire people. Elon's going to do that. Did you actually authorize that? And they're just trying to sort of. And I just had to laugh because, first of all, Trump handled it very well. He said, Elon is doing his thing. He's doing great. That's what we asked him to do. And if there's any problems, I'm the president. I decide. Perfect answer. But I kind of had to laugh because what was unfolding before my eyes was Elon and Trump were playing good cop, bad cop.
Yes.
And Elon was the bad cop. If you told someone like a few years ago that Elon and Trump were going to take apart the deep state and Elon was going to be the bad cop, they would have laughed at you. But that's actually happening now.
I think even if that's a great point. I think even if you just step back, 6 months and said that Trump wouldn't be the focal point of all the ire of Democrats, but that it would be Elon instead, to your good cop, bad cop situation, I think I would have probably said, no, come on, it's mostly going to be focused on Trump. And that's not what's happening right now. All of which helps to keep the Democrats off balance. They really, truly don't know how, I don't think, to respond to what's going on. Their public displays have been laughable. They just continue to degenerate, which is all to the good. And they're also just not being taken seriously. Now the graph just adds fuel to that. So not only are they sort of, discounted, but now it's you guys are corrupt and we can prove you're corrupt.
And the other thing that must be going on in the back of their minds is, when does it reach me?
Yeah.
The way I see USAID, and by the way, there's been some fantastic work done, on people on Twitter and so on, where they've tried to visualize this through these graphs, where it's not that just USAID gives money to ABC company and then that's it. No, it's a huge chain of things. They give money to someone who gives it to someone else who pays their wife a salary, and on and on and on. You can build these big chains. And some people have visualized that. And then you have these gigantic webs, really. It looks like a giant web. And we're still in the process of untangling those webs. I mean, I don't think we've probably seen like 1% of it, and we've only seen USAID, and you could see those webs. I mean, if you just start thinking about the Department of Defense, oh my goodness, can you imagine the webs that you have there? So what's going on in the minds of a lot of these people who are like crying foul right now is, when are they going to find out about this, or when are they going to find out about my wife getting a salary from this or that or whatever? Because there's going to be a lot of that buried in that data.
I think that's right. This whole veneer of imperviousness has been completely taken off. And, they're seeing, we have the layoffs going at the larger federal workforce to begin with. So already jobs are kind of, that level of security. I mean, those used to be the most secure jobs. And suddenly they're anything but. And then on top of that, you suddenly have the graph being exposed. And I would sense, I keep thinking of Norm Eisen. I think there was this sense that nobody's going to do anything, that Trump's still a lot of bluster, and when he gets in, he'll try to fix some stuff, but he's not really going to go after anybody. And then all of a sudden, the FBI is being asked for a list of everybody who worked on things. And I've watched, Norm Eisen, the guy that led all the illegal lawfare. That dude looks like he's getting closer to a nervous breakdown in real time. And he went from being very cocky, and all of a sudden he's going on these podcasts and he's looking very, very unsettled. And I think that's a microcosm to kind of the larger feeling that's out there that, oh my God, he's actually serious. We didn't really think it might affect us directly. It might.
And it is going to filter back to them in some way. I mean, Eisen, very much so.
Some direct, some indirect, but yeah.
One of the things I've been thinking about, again, having thought about it years ago, and periodically over time, but it's sort of really come back into focus, is Russiagate. We haven't even scratched the surface of that in terms of the we know about, the FBI was paying their fake sources and that kind of stuff. But we know, for instance, that journalists were in the pockets of the Clinton campaign. But can you imagine what we might be able to find out in the next, months here in terms of where that money actually came from, as well as all the unknown unknowns, which are, I guess now they're unknown knowns. So we know there's some really bad stuff. There's some horrible Russiagate stuff that was funded by USAID and organizations like that, basically by US taxpayers. So we now know that, but we just don't know the details. That's going to be another one that is just going to be absolutely massive, even to people like us who've looked into this for the past, 8 years or so.
Yeah, I think that's right. Another area that it all coincidental, but is donor advised funds, or DAFs.
Right, exactly.
And, for people who are unaware, it's sort of a conduit between grants they can go into. It's almost like a financial advisory pool. And then disbursements can be made from there. So what earlier when I said grant laundering, this is kind of what I was referring to, is the idea that you could have somebody like USAID make an innocuous sounding grant for something that isn't too specific, sounds kind of happy, again, nutrition for children, or, whatever, you make up your term, goes into these DAFs, and it can actually be directed to come out as something entirely different. So you could look up a grant and you could see what the amount was. You're not if it goes into a DAF, you actually don't know how it was used, because DAFs are sort of this shield where they don't have to say how that money was dispersed. So it's a way to take grants that the public will accept. Okay, they made a grant for X. That sounds good. We're not going to question it. They don't know how that money was actually used. And I think once that starts to get looked at a little bit more closely, that's going to open up an entire other can of worms.
I hope the focus stays on all this stuff, and I think it will. But Democrats will be absolutely desperate to try and come up with something new, some new hoax, like the Russiagate thing.
They have
basically
to.
occupied everyone's attention for 3 years, nonstop. Then you had this impeachment scandal, so-called scandal, that occupied everyone's attention for a year. Then they obviously COVID occupied everyone for a long time. Then they tried to make J6 occupy everyone for forever. They're obviously looking for something like that. They're absolutely desperate to find something that they can spin into, something where all the attention is on that. The one thing that I find is not going to work for them anymore is that Republicans, especially the sort of just the random people out there on Twitter and out there in the public, don't fall for it anymore. Have you seen how Democrats scream, Elon is stealing taxpayer money, or this or that or whatever? And
he's stealing your personal information.
Yeah. It's like what J.D. Vance said, I don't really care, Margaret. That's the meme. But it's really true. So they're going to have to dig deeper into the trick box or come up with new tricks, because that old trick is not going to work. Oh, right, Donald Trump is a Russian agent. Isn't going to work anymore. It did work 8 years ago. It worked fantastically well for them because it sucked in, pretty much everyone. I mean, it sucked us in terms of disproving it, but it sucked a lot of people in, Republicans too, especially in Congress, in terms of, oh my goodness, we better have a special counsel and all that kind of stuff. That's not going to happen anymore. Now, I wonder what it is they're going to try and come up with.
Yeah,
Every time I think about it, I kind of want to stop thinking about it because I can only come up with really, really bad
really,
stuff,
really
which
bad
I
things.
really, really don't like to think about.
Yep, I'm in the exact same mind. It's everything goes in cycles, and it's easy right now. Everything feels wonderful, and it's easy to kind of feel like, we've got them, and we kind of do. But it's I think it's naive to think that there's not going to be a response, and a response that maybe has already been planned, because we really are talking about an existential threat. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but in many respects, it's just not. We're talking about kind of the livelihood of all of these people, overturning everything, taking back all the money in the graph that was going to perpetuate this and pulling that back in. And I just cannot rationally bring myself to believe that there's not going to be some kind of response, a significant one, a systemic response from the system. And I take heart by the fact that the system is so utterly off balance at the moment. And maybe that wins out. But just like you, when I allow myself to think about what type of responses there could be, I don't like to think about them. And just as you said, I kind of mentally pull myself back from those. Because all the usual scams and those kind of things, they're going to be totally ineffectual. They're not going to work. So I kind of feel like either we get no real response other than just screeching, or something a little darker that I don't really care to think about.
Sadly, yes. And then when you also factor in, it's not just that the gravy train has come to a stop, but also the criminal liability aspect of it. Um, let's put it this way: if you
You mean in
just
terms
put
of people facing real outcomes?
people who took the money, people who lied about taking the money, people who funneled the money to themselves in some way, uh, whether it's through a spouse or through some, shell company, this, that, and the other. I mean, all of the scams that were going on here. Um, like, for instance, the political thing, I don't think there's any particular liability there. It was just corrupt, but they made it in a way that, oh, well, where were the government? We needed subscriptions, ridiculous as that is. And what was one subscription? It was like a $500,000 or just something just mind-blowingly crazy.
Like 500 odd $1,000 for, what was it, 31 licenses or subscriptions or whatever.
Right. And what you get in return is good coverage or bad coverage for Republicans. Okay, this is terrible, but it's going to be difficult to make a legal case out of that.
Mm-hmm.
When the Pentagon buys a pencil for $100 and someone's spouse gets, a share of that, that's going to be more and more problematic from a legal point of view. But you're going to have both. But here's the thing. If the federal government just puts, like, say, 10% of the effort that they put into the January 6th stuff, where they had 5,000 FBI employees on the case, if they just put a tenth of that effort into this, you're going to have massive, massive problems in terms of, people being rounded up for corruption. And that is a fear that is even worse than my gravy train has now come to an end. It's just on a higher level, which only reinforces what you just said, where, yeah, I don't really want to think about what they're going to do next, but it might get a lot darker.
With all of that said, though, I think what, kind of circling back to the whole start of this is, we're really finding ourselves at the arrival potentially of an entirely new era, where it's just a restructuring, a fundamental restructuring of the government, where the whole way of doing things is just being taken back. Power is being returned to the people. Money's being returned to the people. And this idea that the financial aspect of it was really the glue that kept the establishment together, and we're now pulling that apart. What's, the goal has been to sort of break the establishment. We've now arrived at the point where we are actively breaking the establishment. And, it's going to be really interesting to watch Elon walk from agency to agency, as Trump continues to fundamentally just do what he does in terms of just making America great again. we are in an amazing period, and I don't think that we're even now talking about this, I still don't think we're able to appreciate the full aspect, the full moment in which we actually find ourselves.